There is a moment in early morning when a garden is a completely different place. The light is not yet full. It comes sideways, through trees or over fences, and it lands on things at an angle that reveals a texture the afternoon sun covers over. You see the weight of dew on leaves. You see the grain of bark. You see, in particular detail, the small tree at the far end of the garden, the one you planted several years ago, the one that is doing what slow things do, which is to grow in a way that is almost impossible to track from week to week but unmistakable across years. You planted that tree on a day you still remember, even if the date has gone. The ground was harder than you anticipated. You had underestimated somehow how long it would take to dig a hole large enough. Your hands were sore by the time you were done. You lowered the root ball in carefully, filled the hole back in, pressed the soil down with your boot, and then stood back and looked at this small thing you had committed to the earth. It was not much to look at. A single upright stem, not much thicker than your thumb. A few branches, tentative, reaching in different directions without much conviction. The kind of plant that, if you saw it at a garden center and did not know what it was, you would walk past it. Nothing about its appearance told you what it would become. That was 8 years ago, and the tree now is genuinely a tree. It has a real trunk, real bark with a real texture, real branches that hold the light in ways you have come to know. It is not large, not yet, but it is unmistakably itself. It has a shape that is its own, and you can tell without thinking about it when something about the garden is slightly off because you have looked at this tree so many times that any deviation from its usual self registers immediately. You know this tree. Here is the thing that is worth pausing on. You barely know the plants that grew fast, the ones that filled their corner of the garden in a single season and put on a spectacular show and then faded. You can describe them if you try. You can remember their general color, their approximate height, but they are not in your body the way this tree is. They are more like things that happened to you once. The tree is something you have been in relationship with, for years, without quite deciding to be. Think about it. The annuals from 2 summers ago were magnificent. They came up in days, filled their beds by June, and were spectacular through August. And now, trying to picture them, you get a vague impression of color and height. You remember that they were there. You do not remember them the way you remember this tree. That distinction between things that happen to you quickly and things you are in relationship with over time turns out to be one of the most important distinctions a person can make. Not just in a garden, everywhere. Most of us were not taught this. We were taught the opposite. We grew up being rewarded for quick results. We were told in various ways that slow things were problems to be solved. That efficiency was a virtue. That if something was taking too long, the solution was to find a faster method, not to stay with the slow one. The garden never agreed with any of that. But it cannot argue with you. It cannot tell you that you are wrong. It can only show you, over the years that you spend with it, a different way of understanding growth, a different relationship with time. And the people who have stayed with a garden long enough really stayed with it, not as a weekend activity but as an ongoing presence in their lives, tend to come to a particular understanding, one that is hard to put into words until someone gives you the words. The things that grow the slowest are the ones that change you the most. Not because slow is better, as a general principle, not because patience is a virtue in some abstract moral sense, but because of something very specific about how human beings encode experience, about how memory works, about what happens to a person when they pay attention to the same thing over years rather than weeks. When you understand this, it reframes a lot of things. It reframes why certain memories from your childhood are more vivid than almost anything from your 30s, even though your 30s were objectively more eventful. It reframes why the relationships you stayed in, the ones that grew slowly and sometimes invisibly, are the ones that shaped who you are, while many of the more dramatic encounters have receded entirely. It reframes the way you think about what you are growing now, in whatever patch of earth you have, and what it is doing to you while you wait for it to do something visible. The fastest things you have ever grown, you barely remember. And that is not an accident. That is something worth understanding fully. But before we can get to why slow growth changes a person in the ways it does, we need to understand something about the world that told us growing things slowly was a waste of time. because that story did not arrive by accident, and it changed something in all of us. Something changed in the second half of the 20th century, and it changed quietly enough that most people did not notice it was changing. It was not one thing. It was a series of things that accumulated, each small shift building on the last, until the whole orientation of daily life was different. Not dramatically different on any single day, but profoundly different across a generation. The thing that changed was our relationship with waiting. There was a time not that long ago in historical terms when waiting was simply part of life. You waited for bread to rise. You waited for seeds to germinate. You waited for a letter to arrive. You waited for news, for seasons, for fruit to ripen. Waiting was not experienced as failure. It was not a gap in the system that needed to be closed. It was the texture of time. It was just how things worked. And then, gradually, it stopped being that. New technologies, new logistics, new ways of organizing commerce were all built on the same premise, that speed was the point, that the value of something increased as the waiting decreased, that the best version of any experience was the fastest version. The food that arrived in minutes was better than the food you had to wait for. The information you could access in seconds was better than the information you had to find slowly. The result you could see immediately was more valuable than the result you had to tend for years. This was sold to us and we bought it because it felt like progress, because in many ways it was progress. Speed has genuine value. Speed saves lives in medicine. Speed enables connection across distances. There is nothing wrong with speed as one option among many. But somewhere in the transaction, we lost the option to choose slow. It stopped being an option and started being a failure mode. A thing that happened to you when you had not figured out the faster way. A thing that marked you as behind. And here is what that did to the people who grew things. Gardening is one of the few activities left in modern life that genuinely cannot be hurried past a certain point. You can optimize. You can prepare the soil more carefully, time your plantings better, water more consistently. But you cannot make an oak tree grow faster by wanting it to. You cannot accelerate spring. You cannot negotiate with a fruit tree about when it is ready. The garden operates on its own timeline, and that timeline is not interested in your schedule. For a long time, this was seen as a problem, as one of gardening's limitations, something to be engineered around, and the market responded accordingly. Faster varieties, quicker results, plants bred for rapid production rather than depth of flavor or longevity of yield. The same logic that had entered everything else entered the garden too. But something unexpected happened. The people who kept gardening slowly, who kept working with perennials, who kept planting trees they would not sit under for 20 years, who kept composting and amending soil, and doing the slow work that does not produce visible results until long after you have forgotten you did it, those people started noticing something. They were calmer, not in a smug way, not as a performance, but in a way that their friends and family noticed before they noticed it themselves. They had a different relationship with setbacks. When something did not work, they did not panic. They adjusted. They tried again next season. They had developed, without labeling it as such, what psychologists would call a long-time horizon. The ability to hold a goal in mind across months and years without needing daily confirmation that progress was happening. And this capacity, which they had built by spending time with slow things, transferred into their relationships, into their work, into the way they handled the ordinary frustrations of a life in its second half. Because here is something that the culture of speed was not able to tell you. A person who has spent years tending something slow has trained their nervous system in a way that almost nothing else can replicate. They have rehearsed, over and over, the experience of doing something whose results you will not see for a long time. And that rehearsal changes you. It changes what you can tolerate. It changes what you expect. It changes the very size of the unit of time in which you live. Most people in the culture of fast live in hours and days. The feedback loops they are used to are short. Something happens, you respond. Something changes, you move on. But the person who has been waiting for a slow tree to come into its own has learned, in their body and not just their mind, how to live in years, how to hold something lightly over a long period, attending to it without demanding immediate results. And that, it turns out, is one of the most valuable skills a person can develop, not for the garden, for everything. But the culture did not tell us that, because the culture was busy selling us something else. It was selling us the idea that the slow path was a detour, that slow things were simply lesser versions of fast things, that patience was a nice idea but not a practical one. That transaction cost us something most of us did not recognize we had lost. Until we stopped. Until we stood in a garden on an ordinary morning and found ourselves face to face with something that had been growing quietly, at its own pace, indifferent to our schedules, our urgencies, our need for visible results. We found ourselves face to face with what slow things actually know. And it turned out to be more than we expected. There is a particular kind of wood that only forms in trees that have been allowed to grow slowly. Violin makers know this. They travel to mountains where the winters are harsh and long and the growing seasons are brief. The trees there grow in conditions that barely permit growth at all. What they produce is wood with very tight grain, rings compressed so close together they are almost invisible to the naked eye. This wood resonates differently. It holds sound in a way that wood from faster trees simply does not. The finest violins ever made were built from this wood. Not only because of the skill of the makers, though the skill was extraordinary, but also because the trees they had access to grew slowly, in cold, compressed time, and produced something that faster trees of the same species cannot replicate. The slow growth itself is the ingredient. This is not a metaphor. This is a physical property of the material. The density that slow growth produces, the intricate cell structure that develops when a tree cannot race upward but must instead build carefully, produces a structural integrity that rapid growth skips over. A fast tree allocates resources to height. A slow tree, in conditions that do not permit the luxury of speed, builds strength through its cross-section. It grows into itself rather than above itself. Root systems work the same way. When you water a garden frequently, giving the soil a light daily drink, the shallow roots of most plants never need to reach far. Water is available at the surface. The plants grow, they produce, they do what you want them to do, but their root systems stay in the top few centimeters of soil. They are entirely dependent on you. Stop watering for a week and many of them will show it. When you water less often but more deeply, when you let the soil dry slightly between waterings, something different happens. The roots go looking. They extend downward, searching for moisture, building a network that reaches far below the surface. These plants are harder to stress. They can tolerate a dry spell. They have resources you cannot see from above. The slowness built the depth. This is what slow things know, not as a lesson they were taught, but as a structural fact of their development. The conditions that prevent fast growth produce a different quality of growth entirely. Something denser, more resilient, more internally complex. Something that has, because it could not take shortcuts, developed in ways that speed simply bypasses. Now apply this to a person. The experiences that change people most fundamentally are rarely the fast ones. They are the ones that extended over time, that required sustained attention, that did not resolve quickly and therefore had to be lived with. The grief that did not lift in a week, the skill that took years to develop, the relationship that was built slowly, through ordinary time spent together, through disagreements and repairs, through the accumulation of small shared moments over years. These experiences change the structure of a person, not metaphorically, neurologically. The brain rewires itself in response to sustained experience in ways it does not rewire in response to brief experience. This is well documented. Long learning produces different neural architecture than short learning. The person who has practiced something for 10 years has a brain that is literally differently shaped from the person who practiced it for 10 weeks. And what you practice matters less than the fact that you sustain it. The gardener who has tended the same plot for 15 years, noticing what comes back and what fails too, adjusting planting positions based on accumulated observation, watching the same areas fill with life in spring and then empty in autumn, has developed a form of attention that is extremely difficult to produce any other way. It is not just knowledge, though there is knowledge. It is a particular quality of sustained noticing, of staying with something through all of its stages, of knowing an organism, a place, a cycle, the way you know it when you have been present for all of its versions and not just the impressive one. This kind of knowing is only available to those who stayed. You cannot download it. You cannot read your way to it. The person who has read about gardening extensively and the person who has gardened for 15 years have different relationships with uncertainty. The reader is confident about what they know. The gardener is confident about what they cannot predict. This is the deeper intelligence, the one that only slow time can build. What this means practically is that the things most worth doing, in a garden or anywhere else, are often the things that cannot show results quickly. The slow improvements to soil that take 3 years to fully manifest. The perennial border that does not hit its stride until its fourth season. The relationship with a particular variety that requires several growing seasons before you understand how it behaves in your specific conditions. These things reward staying. They punish rushing. They are, in the most literal sense, unavailable to anyone who is not willing to invest time that does not produce visible returns. Which raises a question worth sitting with. What are the things in your own life that you have stayed with long enough to know in this way? And what are the things you abandoned before they had finished teaching you? Because there is a particular kind of loss that does not feel like loss in the moment. It feels like a sensible decision. It feels like moving on. It feels like efficiency. But it is loss. And the person who has planted a tree that takes 20 years to mature understands this in a way that most people in the modern world are never given the chance to understand. They planted it anyway, not for themselves, for what would come after. And that single act, planting for a future you may not fully inhabit, changes a person in ways that are almost impossible to explain until you have done it. In ancient Greece, there was a practice among farmers that did not survive into the modern world. When someone planted a walnut tree, they would say aloud to whoever was present that they were not planting it for themselves. They were planting it for their children, or their grandchildren, or simply for those who would come after. The walnut was understood to be a gift across time. The person planting it would very likely never eat from it. That was not the point. The point was the act itself, of putting something in the earth whose full value would only arrive long after you were gone. This was not considered unusual. It was considered right. It was understood that the land is not yours in the way a tool is yours. You are passing through it. You received it from those who came before, already improved by their work, and you hand it on to those who come after, ideally improved by yours. The walnut tree was a form of promise to the future, a tangible statement that you believed there would be a future worth leaving something for. This understanding has almost entirely disappeared from the way most people relate to land now. We use land, we develop it, we produce from it as efficiently as we can for as long as we need it, and then we move on. The idea of planting something you will never fully enjoy, doing work whose fruits you will never taste, is alien to the logic of short productivity that has replaced the older relationship with the earth. But it has not disappeared from gardening. You find it still in the people who plant saplings at the age of 60, in the people who put a climbing rose against a young wall, knowing the best of it will come in a decade, in the people who amend and build soil not because they expect to see the results this season, but because the person who gardens this plot after them will inherit something better than what they themselves inherited. These people know something that the productivity mindset cannot fully reach. They know that the act of planting for the future changes you in the present. That doing something whose reward will arrive for someone else, or for your future self so distant it almost feels like someone else, produces a different quality of attention than doing something for immediate return. It asks something different of you. It requires a different relationship with your own ego, your own time, your own sense of what work is for. There is a concept in psychology that researchers have examined under various names, most often called future self-continuity. It refers to how strongly a person identifies with who they will be in 10 or 20 years. People who score high on this measure tend to make better long decisions. They take better care of their health. They invest in relationships and skills and places whose returns arrive slowly. They treat their future self as a real person whose interests matter, not as an abstraction too distant to take seriously. Gardeners who work with slow plants develop this quality almost by accident, because you cannot plant a fruit tree without thinking about the future. You cannot build a perennial border without imagining what it will look like in 3 years. The act of gardening over time trains you to think in longer arcs. It makes your future self feel real, because the garden makes the future visible in a way that is very hard to achieve any other way. The tree you plant today, the one that will not give fruit for 5 years, is a physical relationship between you and the person you will be when it finally bears. Every time you tend it, water it through a dry summer, stake it against a storm, you are having a conversation with your future self. And that conversation, carried on over years, shapes who that person turns out to be. There is also something else at work, something harder to name but just as real. When you plant for the future, you accept your own impermanence. You acknowledge, without having to say it out loud, that you are not the end of the story, that this patch of earth had a life before you arrived and will have a life after you leave, that the mark you make is not in what you consume or take, but in what you leave better than you found it. This is a kind of peace that the productivity mindset cannot manufacture. It cannot be achieved through optimization or efficiency. It arrives only through the act of planting, something you may never see in its fullness. Through the experience of caring for something whose prime is in a future that may not include you. This sounds heavy when described directly. In practice, it feels like the lightest thing in the garden. It is the moment when you stop needing the garden to perform for you and start allowing it simply to exist, on its own schedule, according to its own logic. And something changes in you when that happens. You become, almost without noticing, someone who can tolerate a longer horizon. Someone who is less anxious about today's results because you have anchored yourself in something that extends well beyond today. Someone who finds, perhaps for the first time in a long while, that the ordinary pace of a day is bearable, even comfortable, because you have something slow to return to. The walnut farmer in ancient Greece, who planted without expecting to harvest, understood this. It was not wisdom he read about. It was wisdom the planting taught him. And in planting for others, he changed himself. But the act of patient waiting over years is doing something even more specific to a person than this. Something that goes deeper than peace or a longer horizon. It is literally rewiring the brain. And the science of how that happens is stranger and more profound than most people expect. In 1960, a researcher at Stanford gave a marshmallow to a group of 4-year-old children. He told them they could eat it now, or they could wait 15 minutes, and if they waited, they would get a second marshmallow. Then he left the room. Some children ate the marshmallow immediately. Some waited the full 15 minutes. Some lasted 2 minutes before giving in. Some held out for 8 or 10, using elaborate strategies to avoid looking at the marshmallow, turning away from it, covering their eyes with their hands, singing quietly to themselves. The researcher followed these children for decades, and what he found became one of the most cited findings in psychology. The children who had waited longest went on to have, on average, better outcomes across a remarkable range of measures: higher educational attainment, better social skills, lower rates of substance use, better health, greater life satisfaction in their 40s and 50s. The ability to tolerate waiting, at 4 years old, predicted a great deal about what a person would become. This finding has been debated, refined, and complicated since it was first published. The picture is more nuanced than the original experiment suggested, as it always is. Factors like economic security and family stability turned out to matter enormously. A child who has learned that adults do not always follow through on promises is entirely rational to eat the marshmallow now. The experiment was not simply measuring willpower. It was measuring, in part, trust and the experience of a reliable world. But the core insight survived the scrutiny. The capacity to wait, the capacity to tolerate the gap between effort and reward, turns out to matter enormously. And that capacity is not fixed. It develops, or it atrophies, depending entirely on what you practice. Here is what most people in the culture of speed never learn. Waiting is a skill, a learnable, buildable, improvable skill. Like any skill, it develops through practice. And like any skill, if you never practice it, you lose the capacity for it. The brain is plastic. It reorganizes itself in response to experience. A life structured around immediate feedback loops, around the expectation that every action should produce a rapid, visible result, produces a brain that is tuned for exactly that. And a brain tuned for rapid feedback becomes increasingly unable to function well in the presence of slow returns. It is not that such a person is impatient by nature. It is that they have been shaped, by years of practice, into a particular relationship with time. A gardener is practicing something different. Every time you go out to the garden and do something whose effect will not be visible for weeks, you are training your brain in the experience of effortful waiting. You are rehearsing the felt sense of investment without immediate return. You are doing what the marshmallow children did when they turned away from the table and occupied themselves with something else while they waited. You are building the capacity to hold out. And this capacity, built in the garden, transfers. It transfers to the experience of learning something new and difficult, where progress is invisible for long stretches. It transfers to relationships, where the work of repair and deepening is slow and often invisible. It transfers to the management of your own health, where the benefits of consistent good habits take years to fully manifest. It transfers, in short, to almost everything that matters. But there is something more specific happening, beyond the general training of patience. When you tend something slow, you develop a relationship with uncertainty that is qualitatively different from the relationship most people have with it. Because the garden is uncertain in a very specific way. You do not know if the tree will survive the winter. You do not know if the late frost will take the blossoms. You do not know, despite all your care and attention, whether this will be a good year or a hard one. You learn to hold this uncertainty without it consuming you. Philosophers call this equanimity. Psychologists call it stress tolerance. In practice, it feels like something much simpler. It feels like being able to walk out the morning after a storm and assess what happened without catastrophizing, and then do what needs to be done, and then go on with your day. It feels like the capacity to absorb a loss, acknowledge it, and continue. People who garden for years develop this not because they read about it, because they practiced it. Season after season of uncertain outcomes, of things they could not control, of results that depended on factors well beyond their management. They learned in their bodies that uncertainty does not require panic, that you can do your best work and still not know how it ends, and that this is not a problem. Because the garden will tell you what it needs next, and then you do that, and then you wait. The researcher who followed the marshmallow children into their 50s found something else worth noting. The people who reported the most satisfaction with their lives were not necessarily the ones who had achieved the most. They were the ones who had developed the most comfortable relationship with time itself, the ones who did not feel perpetually behind, who did not experience their life as a race they were losing. Many of them, it turned out, had things they tended, things they returned to, season after season, with no expectation of dramatic results. Not all of them were gardens, but they had the quality of a garden. Something slow, something that asked for waiting. Something that, in asking for waiting, gave back something more important than what it received. But there is a quality about what the garden does that I have not yet fully described. Because what happens in the garden is not only about the internal life of the person tending it. It is also about what it means to be in genuine relationship with something that operates on a completely different scale of time, something that will outlast you, something that does not know you are in a hurry. And that relationship is stranger and more beautiful than most people expect. Everything in a garden knows what season it is. Not in the way you might know it, looking at a calendar or checking a date on your phone. In a deeper way, a cellular way. The seed that has been dormant in cold soil since October knows, without being told, when the temperature has shifted enough to mean spring. It does not rush this assessment. It takes the measure of its conditions over time, averaging across days rather than responding to one warm afternoon. It knows the difference between a warm day in February and actual spring. And it waits until it is certain before it commits to germinating. The plant that holds its flower buds closed against late frosts knows something similar. It is not being cautious in a human sense. It is not anxious. It is simply operating according to an extremely finely tuned set of responses developed over millions of years, responses that say, "Not yet. Wait. There will be a right moment, and this is not it." And the tree, especially the slow tree, operates in a time frame that makes a human year look like an afternoon. An oak tree can live for centuries. The decisions it makes, if you can use that word for what a tree does, are decisions across a span that no single human being can hold in full experience. Its roots go deeper than you can see. Its crown develops over decades toward a particular equilibrium with light and wind and neighboring trees. It is constantly adjusting, but on a scale invisible to any individual observer. Spending time with trees teaches you something about your own timescale that is very difficult to learn any other way. You are not in the garden for centuries. You are there for decades if you are fortunate. And if you have been gardening for 15 of those years, you have the perspective of 15 years in a place. You know the south corner that floods every wet spring. You know the area under the apple tree where nothing will grow and you stopped trying 6 years ago. You know the volunteer elder that appeared one year and that you kept because you were curious, and that is now too large to remove without regret. You know this place across time, and knowing a place across time changes the scale at which you experience your own life. Most people in the ordinary rush of daily existence live primarily in the immediate. They wake to today's problems, move through today's obligations, go to sleep with tomorrow's concerns already loading. The medium and long term recede to a background hum. The sense of a life as something unfolding across decades, as something that will look different from where you are now when seen from 20 years hence, gets lost. The garden resists this, not by demanding reflection, not by forcing anything, simply by being what it is, which is a place that operates on multiple timescales simultaneously. You are planting for this season and for next season and for 5 years from now, all in the same afternoon. You are responding to what happened last winter when you decide where to plant this spring. You are thinking about the shape of a border in 3 years when you choose what to put in today. This holding of short and medium and long time simultaneously, in a single afternoon in the garden, is exactly what makes it different from almost every other activity available to you. It trains you to inhabit more of your timeline. There is research on this. Studies of people who report the highest quality of well-being in their 50s and 60s consistently point to a set of characteristics that have a great deal to do with time. These people tend to live more fully in the present than people who report lower well-being, but they also carry a stronger sense of long purpose. They are not choosing between present and future. They somehow inhabit both. Gardeners describe this experience without naming it. They talk about how the garden grounds them in the immediate, in the soil under their hands, in the specific texture of this plant's leaves, in the smell of this specific afternoon. And at the same time, they carry an ongoing relationship with what this space will be in spring, in summer, in 5 years. They are fully here, and they are also somehow somewhere across time. This is not a contradiction. It is, in fact, one of the qualities most associated with deep contentment. Not an escape from time, but a comfortable inhabiting of it. A sense that you are not behind, that you are not late, that you are exactly where you are supposed to be, doing what you are supposed to be doing, and that what you are doing will mean something in a future you are already, in some sense, touching. The garden does not hurry, and over time, in ways you often do not notice until a friend mentions it, neither do you. But this change in relationship with time is not only about peace, or about well-being in some quiet abstract sense. It also changes what you can see. Because a person who has learned to inhabit slow time notices things that a person living in perpetual urgency simply cannot perceive. Not because they are smarter, because they have slowed down enough that the slower things become visible. And what becomes visible, in a garden and everywhere else, when you slow down enough, is something that most people rush past every day of their lives. Something that changes the way you understand loss and memory and what you are actually doing with the time you have. There is a particular kind of forgetting that does not feel like forgetting. It feels like being busy. It feels like efficiency. It feels like getting things done. And it is only later, sometimes much later, that you understand you were not getting things done. You were moving past things without entering them. And by moving past them, you lost them. Not the events themselves, which still happen, but the experience of the events. The felt sense of having been fully there. Think about the last meal you ate in a genuine hurry. Not just a quick lunch because you had a meeting, but a meal eaten with half your attention elsewhere at speed, tasting almost nothing, done before the flavor had registered. You consumed it. You did not experience it. And now, asked to recall it, you almost cannot. There is almost nothing there. Now think about a meal from years ago that you remember in detail. The context, the light, the smell, the specific taste of something, the conversation, the way the afternoon moved. There is something there, something dense and real, something that is still part of you even at this distance. What is the difference? In most cases, the difference is time and attention. The meal you remember, you were present for. Something about the context slowed you down enough to actually be there, to let the experience enter you rather than pass through you. The same is true of everything. The parts of your life you will carry with you are, almost without exception, the parts you were slow for. The ordinary morning you sat with your coffee and watched the light change in the garden. The conversation that went on longer than planned because both of you were genuinely in it. The afternoon you spent doing something with your hands that did not need to produce anything. That was simply the doing of a thing, slowly and without agenda. You have lost, without knowing you were losing, an enormous amount of your life to speed. Not to bad choices, not to wrong turns, to speed, to the habit of moving through experience rather than into it, the habit of getting things done rather than allowing things to happen to you, the habit of treating time as a resource to be used efficiently rather than a substance to be inhabited. The garden is one of the few places left where this habit is genuinely difficult to maintain. You cannot rush a garden efficiently. You can try. You can go out with an agenda and work through it at pace, ticking off tasks. And sometimes that is what a garden needs. But anyone who has gardened for more than a few seasons knows that the best moments are never the efficient ones. They are the moments when you went out to do one thing and ended up doing something entirely different because you noticed something, or because you simply stopped moving for a moment and the garden stopped being a task list and started being a place. And in that moment, something entered you that does not enter you when you are moving at speed. This is not nostalgia. It is not a complaint about modern life. It is an observation about how experience works, about how much of your life is available to you depending on how fast you are moving through it. Those who have studied memory and attention consistently find the same thing. Rich and lasting memories are formed from rich and attentive experience. The brain does not record time equally. It records experience. And the quality of the recording depends on the quality of the attention. Which means that the years of your life when you were most pressed, most productive, most efficiently moving from task to task, may produce thinner memories than a single slow afternoon in a garden. Not because the afternoon was more important, because you were actually there for it. This is a hard thing to sit with, because most of us cannot go back and be present for the years we moved through too fast. They are what they are. But here is what you can do. You can decide now to stop rushing through what is left, not in a dramatic way, not by quitting your commitments or abandoning your obligations, but by choosing, deliberately and consistently, to have at least some portion of your time that belongs to slowness. That belongs to tending something that cannot be hurried. That belongs to the kind of attention that produces the kind of memory that will still be there in 20 years. Most people, when they reach their 40s and 50s, begin to feel a change in their relationship with time that they cannot quite name. Time seems to go faster. Years begin to feel like months. The sensation of life accelerating, which is real and well documented, begins to press on them with an increasing urgency. The antidote to this is not to slow time artificially. It is to fill time with more experience, with richer, more attentive experience, with the kind of experience that, when your brain is looking for something to anchor to in this particular period of your life, it can actually find. A garden gives you this, not automatically, not simply by existing, but by pulling you into a kind of attention that you have to actively practice in almost every other area of your life. And in that attention, something begins to happen that is deeper than memory. Something begins to accumulate. There's a smell that most people who grew up near a garden can identify immediately. Soil after rain. It has a name, petrichor, though most people never need the name because the smell itself is so specific, so unmistakable, so thoroughly associated with particular moments and particular places and particular versions of themselves, that it barely needs to be described. It is one of the most ancient smells a human being can encounter. The compound that produces it is released by soil bacteria, and our sensitivity to it, our ability to detect it in concentrations far lower than almost anything else we can smell, appears to have deep evolutionary roots. Our ancestors could detect it from a great distance because it meant water, and water meant survival. We are hardwired to pay attention to this smell. In a way, we are not hardwired to pay attention to almost anything else. And because we are hardwired to pay attention to it, it encodes deeply. The smell of rain on warm earth takes you somewhere so specific, so immediately, that it can be disorienting. You are walking on a city street in your 50s, and a brief rain hits warm pavement, and suddenly you are 8 years old in a particular garden, at a particular time of day, with a specific quality of afternoon light around you, and the memory is not a summary but a felt reentry. You are briefly, convincingly there. This is what the slow things do to memory that the fast things cannot. Petrichor encodes so deeply because it is attached to experiences you were slow for. Childhood summers in gardens where time moved differently. Afternoons that were not structured, not efficient, not aimed at producing anything. Where you were simply present in a place with your senses fully available. Where the garden was not a task but a world. The brain stores these experiences differently from experiences of speed. Experiences that were emotionally rich, sensorially vivid, and extended in time get stored in a way that makes them more recoverable, more intact, more present in the body as well as the mind. They do not fade the way memories from busy years fade. They remain available, often across decades, with a freshness that surprises you when you encounter them. This is not just a feature of childhood. It is a feature of slow experience at any age. The people who describe their richest memories in later life are almost never describing the busiest periods. They are describing ordinary moments that happen to catch them fully present. The garden on a particular autumn morning, the look of the light on the frost, the smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney, the taste of a tomato they grew themselves, warm from the vine, eaten standing in the garden in August, the sound of rain on the greenhouse glass. These moments anchor time. They give a year something to hang on. Without them, years begin to blur together. Without enough of them, entire decades can become a general impression of having been busy. With them, life has texture. It has a specific and recoverable quality. It is possible to locate yourself in it, to say, I know who I was then because I remember that afternoon, that smell, that particular quality of light. There is a remarkable body of work on what psychologists call autobiographical memory, the story of a self told through recovered episodes. People with a rich autobiographical memory, a life they can return to in detail, tend to have higher well-being across many measures. They have a stronger sense of identity. They know who they are across time because they can remember who they have been. They are less susceptible to depression and anxiety, which tend to thrive in the absence of a felt sense of continuous self. And the key predictor of a rich autobiographical memory is not the quantity of experiences a person has had. It is the quality of attention they brought to the experiences they had. Slow experiences, sensorially rich, emotionally present, get encoded in a way that is both deeper and broader. They connect to other memories. They are not isolated events but nodes in a web of associated experience that makes them more accessible, more intact, more alive. A person who has been gardening for 15 years has been building this web all along. They may not have been thinking of it in those terms. They were just gardening. But in the background, without any effort or intention on their part, they were storing up something. A self that can be recovered. A life they can actually return to. This is perhaps the deepest thing the slow things do for a person. Not the patience they build, not the connection with future time, not the recalibration of speed, though all of these are real and all of these matter. It is that they make you real to yourself. In a world of fast experience, of process time, of days that pass without being fully inhabited, the slow experience of tending a garden gives you something to come home to inside yourself. An accumulation of specific, recoverable moments that constitute a felt record of a life you were actually in. This is not something you can buy. It cannot be shortcut. It is built, the way good soil is built, through patient work over time, through the accumulation of many ordinary days in which you paid attention to something that was growing slowly in front of you. And those days leave their mark in ways that are still present, still alive, still recoverable, long after the garden itself has changed beyond recognition. But there is one more thing the slow things do, and it is the thing most people who have experienced it find the hardest to explain. They change your sense of who you are, not by teaching you something about yourself, by growing a self in you that was not there before. There is a particular question that tends to arrive sometime in the fifth decade. Not for everyone, not always clearly, but for many people, somewhere in their 40s or 50s, a question surfaces that they were too busy to hear in earlier years. Who am I when the doing stops? Not who am I in my work, not who am I in my role as parent or partner or colleague, but underneath all of that, beyond all of that, in the stillness when there is nothing to perform for and no one watching, what is actually there? For some people, this question is frightening. It arrives in a moment of stillness they have not chosen, perhaps in the aftermath of a loss or a transition, and it finds them unprepared. They have built their sense of self around doing, around producing, around their role in other people's lives. And in the stillness, they find something unexpectedly thin. For others, the question is not frightening at all. It is almost welcome, because they have, over the years, without making it a project, built something underneath the doing, something that does not depend on productivity or performance, something that is simply there. Often, though not always, this has something to do with what they grew. Not metaphorically, literally. The people who have spent years growing things, tending things, returning season after season to a patch of earth, seem to carry a self that is available to them in stillness. A self that is grounded, that knows itself in a particular way, that does not require external confirmation to feel real. This is not wisdom you can acquire from a book. It is not a practice you can begin in your 50s and immediately access. It is built over years the way the tree you planted builds its rings, one per year, invisible from the outside, compressing into structure, into density, into something that endures. The gardener who has been at it for 15 years has 15 years of that compression, 15 springs of returning to find what survived, 15 autumns of putting things to bed and letting go of what did not make it, 15 winters of trusting that the dormant things are not dead, 15 summers of heat and drought, and the particular effort of keeping things alive when they do not want to be. And all of that over 15 years becomes something. It becomes a knowledge of cycles that lives in the body, not just the mind. A trust in return that was not built on faith but on repeated direct experience. A relationship with loss that is grounded in the observation that loss is not the end. That what died in August may come back in April. That the garden you buried under frost in November is the same garden you walk out to, astonished, in March. This is not philosophy. This is what happens to a person who has stayed with a slow thing across enough years that they have seen it come around again, and again, and again. The self that is built through this experience is not the same as the self built through achievement. It is not measured in outcomes. It does not keep score. It is something more like a quality of presence. The capacity to be fully where you are, in full contact with what is in front of you, without needing it to be different than it is. Psychologists studying how people develop through serious adversity consistently find that the people who come through most whole are the ones who have some practice of sustained, grounded attention, something they return to, something slow and reliable and not contingent on external circumstances, something that keeps being itself regardless of what is happening in the rest of their life. For many of the people studied, that thing was a garden. Not because gardens are magic, because gardens are persistently real. They keep being real regardless of what is happening elsewhere. When your career collapses, the garden is still there. When a relationship ends, the garden is still there. When the world feels unrecognizable, the garden is still there, doing what it does on its own schedule, according to its own logic, asking you to show up and pay attention. And the person who has been showing up and paying attention for years has something to come back to that is bigger than a plant collection. They have a practiced self, a self that knows how to be present, a self that has been trained without meaning to train in the very qualities that matter most when things are hard. The slow things built this, not the fast ones. And here is what is both humbling and extraordinary about this. You cannot go back and be present for the years you rushed through. They are what they are. But you can, right now, wherever you are, however old you are, whatever patch of earth you have access to, begin to plant the slow things. The tree whose fruit you will eat in 5 years. The perennial that will not hit its stride until its fourth season. The compost you are building now for the soil you will plant in 2 years. These are not acts of patience as endurance. They are acts of becoming. You are not waiting for something outside you to grow. You are growing something in yourself, something that takes years to develop, something that once developed is not easily lost. What takes years to grow takes years to forget. Which brings us back to where we started, to the tree at the edge of the garden, to the morning light, to the question you may not have known you were asking when you planted it. It is early morning. The light is still sideways, coming in at an angle that will not last. In another hour it will be full and flat, and the garden will look like itself in the ordinary way. But right now, in this particular light, everything in the garden has a quality of being very specifically itself. Very particular, very there. You are standing in front of the tree you planted 8 years ago. It is taller than your shoulder now. The bark has taken on a character that was not there in the early years, a texture you can see from a distance, a color that changes depending on whether the wood is wet or dry. The branches have established their shapes. You know which ones will carry weight and which ones reach more aspirationally. You know the tree. And this morning, standing in front of it in the sideways light, you understand something about those 8 years that perhaps you did not understand while they were happening. You did not spend 8 years waiting for the tree to grow. You spent 8 years being grown. The tree was the occasion, the slow thing in front of you, the thing that could not be hurried, the thing that operated entirely on its own timeline, was the occasion for something that was happening in you the whole time. Something that required exactly this pace, and this duration, and this specific quality of sustained attention to something that did not reward impatience. You are not the same person who planted it. This is true in the obvious biological sense, but it is true in a deeper sense too, a sense that has to do with what you can tolerate, what you can see, what you carry in your body, what you reach for when things are hard. You are more patient than you were, not because you decided to become patient, because you practiced it, season after season, in the one place where impatience genuinely could not accelerate anything. You have a richer autobiographical self than you did. You can locate yourself in your own life more clearly because you have been paying attention, for years, to something that required you to be present. And that attention left marks, specific, recoverable, vivid marks. You have a longer horizon than you did. You plant for 3 years from now with the same ease that you plant for next summer, because you have learned, in your body and not just in your mind, that the future is real, and that your work now is already in conversation with it. You are less afraid of slow progress, because you have seen slow progress arrive. Not always, not on your schedule, not in the form you expected, but it arrived. The slow things came through. The things you could not see growing turned out to be growing. The things that seemed unchanged across 1 winter or 2 winters or 3 were building something underground, in the dark, quietly, without any need for your encouragement or your belief. And you know now that this is how most of the meaningful things work. Not quickly, not visibly, not on anyone's schedule but their own. What the culture sold you, the idea that the fast things are the real things, that slow things are simply fast things that failed to pick up speed, was wrong. Not maliciously wrong, just wrong. The slow things are a different category entirely. They produce a different kind of material, a different quality of wood, a different depth of root, a different quality of memory, a different density of self. The fastest things you have ever grown, you barely remember. The slow things grew you. And standing in front of the tree this morning, in the particular light of this particular October, you realize something else, something about what comes next. There are more slow things to plant. There always are. The garden is never finished in the way a project is finished. It is finished the way a life is finished, which is to say it is never finished while there is still a season ahead. You can start something today that you will not understand for 5 years. You can put something in the ground this autumn that will have a story you cannot yet imagine. You can commit to tending something through its slow and invisible stages, through its period of apparent stillness, knowing that stillness and inactivity are not the same thing. You know this now in a way you did not when you were younger. You know it because the tree taught you. Not through any lesson, not through any advice that could have been delivered in words. Through 8 years of being slow while you watched. There is a specific kind of peace that arrives when you understand this, not the peace of having finished something, the peace of knowing that slow things are not the problem, that waiting is not wasted time, that the years you cannot account for in visible results were the years when something real was forming, in the soil, in the roots, in you. The tree will be here in another 8 years. And so will you, changed again in ways you cannot yet see. Go slowly. You have time.